Look at a map of American manufacturing in 1970 and you'll see thousands of factories humming across Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, the Carolinas. Steel mills, textile plants, electronics assembly, machine tools. Then look at that same map in 2025. The factories are gone, the buildings are empty, the jobs disappeared, and here's what should disturb you. This didn't happen randomly. It wasn't bad luck. It wasn't just globalization or technology. When you study how American industries collapse, when you trace the pattern from textiles to steel to electronics to semiconductors, you discover something terrifying. They all die the same way. There's a life cycle, a predictable sequence of stages that repeats across every sector, and once you see it, you'll understand why Detroit collapsed, why the Rust Belt exists, and why the industries we depend on today are already entering the same death spiral. This isn't about blaming specific companies. This is about a structural pattern that has played out for 70 years, and it's still happening right now. Let me show you the life cycle, the stages every dying industry passes through, and why the people who understand this pattern profit massively while everyone else loses everything. The pattern appears in textiles first. Before World War II, the American South was the textile capital of the world. Hundreds of mills across North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia. They employed millions. Towns like Kannapolis, Gastonia, Greensboro existed because of the mills. The companies were profitable. Workers had jobs. The system functioned. Then something changed. In the 1950s, the mills started consolidating. Smaller operations were bought by larger conglomerates. Burlington Industries became the largest textile company in the world by acquiring dozens of independent mills. Consolidation always looks rational. Economies of scale, efficiency, modern management. But here's what it actually does. It shifts control from operators to financiers. Independent mill owners understood textiles. They knew fabric, machinery, workers, markets. But conglomerates were run by executives who understood spreadsheets. They didn't know textiles. They knew quarterly earnings, and that changes everything. By the 1960s, the consolidated textile giants faced a problem. Profit margins were thin, labor was expensive, competition was increasing from Japan and later South Korea. So management made a choice. They stopped investing in new technology. They stopped upgrading machinery. They cut maintenance budgets, and they extracted maximum short-term profit from aging equipment. This is the second stage. After consolidation comes underinvestment. And it's not stupid, it's deliberate. If you're running a conglomerate, you don't care about the long-term health of one division. You care about quarterly returns to shareholders. So you milk the assets, you defer maintenance, you avoid capital expenditures, and you pay dividends and executive bonuses with the savings. The mills kept running, but they were dying slowly. Machinery from the 1940s was still operating in the 1970s. Productivity fell, quality declined, and foreign competitors with new equipment started taking market share. By 1980, American textile companies couldn't compete. The natural response would have been investment. Modernize the mills, install new looms, automate. But that requires capital and long-term thinking, and the conglomerates had spent decades prioritizing short-term extraction over long-term investment. So instead of modernizing, they offshored. This is the third stage. When underinvestment makes domestic production uncompetitive, companies move production overseas. Not because labor is cheaper, though that's part of it, because they let their domestic operations deteriorate to the point where offshoring is the only option. Burlington Industries closed dozens of American mills in the 1980s and 1990s. They moved production to Mexico, Central America, and Asia. Thousands of workers lost jobs. Towns collapsed, but the company survived. The executives kept their salaries. Shareholders got returns, and the brand continued. The company hollowed out, but the financial structure remained. By 2000, most American textile production was gone. The mills were abandoned. The workers retrained or left, and the companies that had dominated the industry either went bankrupt or existed as brand management operations with no manufacturing. Burlington Industries filed for bankruptcy in 2001. What had been the largest textile company in the world became a brand license to overseas manufacturers. This is the fourth stage. After offshoring comes financialization. The company stops being a manufacturer and becomes a financial entity. It owns intellectual property, manages supply chains, and extracts profit from overseas factories it doesn't own. The actual production, the machinery, the workers, the expertise, that's all gone. The pattern in textiles played out over 50 years. But once it was established, it accelerated, because financiers learned the model, and they applied it to steel. American steel in 1970 was the foundation of the economy. US Steel, Bethlehem Steel, Republic Steel. These companies built the infrastructure, the skyscrapers, the cars, the military equipment. They employed hundreds of thousands. They were politically powerful, and they were enormously profitable. Then consolidation began. In the 1960s and 1970s, steel companies merged and acquired competitors. The logic was the same as textiles: scale, efficiency, market power. But the result was the same. Control shifted from steelmakers to financial managers. US Steel was run for generations by people who understood blast furnaces, ore quality, alloy composition. But by the 1970s, it was run by executives trained in finance and law. They understood balance sheets, not steel, and immediately the pattern repeated. Instead of investing in new technology, the companies extracted profit. Japan was building modern steel mills with continuous casting and electric arc furnaces. Germany was investing in automation, but American steel companies were paying dividends and buying back stock. They were using profits to reward shareholders, not to upgrade equipment. By 1980, American steel mills were using technology from the 1950s. Productivity was half that of Japanese competitors. Quality was lower, costs were higher, and market share was collapsing. Companies had the same choice as textiles: invest or offshore, and they chose the same path. They couldn't offshore steel production as easily as textiles. Steel is heavy, transportation is expensive, but they offshored the profits. US Steel diversified into oil and gas. Bethlehem Steel bought shipyards and engineering firms. They stopped being steel companies and became conglomerates extracting cash from declining steel divisions to invest elsewhere. This is a variation of the third stage. You take the money your legacy operations generate and invest it in other industries, other countries, anything but the core business. And the steel mills kept declining. Employment fell from 400,000 in 1980 to 80,000 by 2000. Entire cities, Pittsburgh, Youngstown, Gary, collapsed. The mills closed. The equipment was sold for scrap. And the companies either went bankrupt or became financial entities managing legacy liabilities. Bethlehem Steel filed for bankruptcy in 2001. US Steel survived but produces a fraction of its former output. The industry didn't die because of bad luck. It died because financialization prioritized short-term extraction over long-term investment. And once the infrastructure decayed past the point of recovery, the companies abandoned it. Now watch the same pattern in electronics. In 1980, America dominated consumer electronics. RCA, Zenith, Motorola. They made televisions, radios, semiconductors. Japan was competing, but American companies were still leaders. Then consolidation. RCA was bought by General Electric in 1986. Zenith merged with LG Electronics. Motorola spun off divisions and sold others. The companies that had invented the technologies were absorbed into conglomerates that cared about diversified revenue streams, not electronics. And immediately, underinvestment. GE didn't want to build television factories. It wanted financial returns. So RCA's manufacturing operations were slowly dismantled. Factories closed. Research and development budgets were cut. The brand continued, but the company stopped innovating. By 1990, American consumer electronics were uncompetitive. Sony, Panasonic, Samsung had better technology and lower costs, not because their labor was cheaper, because they were investing in manufacturing while American companies were cutting costs. So American companies offshored. Motorola moved production to Malaysia. RCA licensed its brand to Chinese manufacturers. The factories in Indiana, Illinois, New York, they closed. Tens of thousands of jobs disappeared, and the companies became brand managers, designing products in America and having them built overseas. This is the critical insight. Offshoring isn't just about labor costs, it's the inevitable result of decades of underinvestment. If you don't upgrade your factories, don't train your workers, don't invest in new processes, eventually your domestic operations can't compete. And offshoring becomes the only way to survive. But here's what happens next. Once you offshore production, you lose manufacturing expertise. The engineers who understood how to build televisions retired or moved to other industries. The supply chains dissolved. The equipment was sold. and after a generation, the knowledge was gone. By 2010, America couldn't manufacture consumer electronics at scale even if it wanted to. The infrastructure, the expertise, the supply chains, everything had been dismantled, and companies that had offshored production discovered they didn't even need to exist. RCA as a manufacturing company is gone. The brand is licensed. Zenith is a trademark owned by LG. Motorola sold its mobile division to Google and then to Lenovo. The companies were financialized into non-existence. They became intellectual property portfolios managed by lawyers and licensed to overseas manufacturers. The pattern is complete. Consolidation, underinvestment, offshoring, financialization, dissolution. And every time, the people who understood the industry tried to warn executives, tried to explain that short-term extraction would destroy long-term viability. And every time, the financial managers ignored them. Because they weren't trying to save the industry, they were trying to maximize returns before it collapsed. Now look at semiconductors, and you'll see the same life cycle already underway. In 1990, America produced half the world's semiconductors: Intel, Texas Instruments, AMD, Micron. The factories were in California, Arizona, Texas. The United States dominated chip design and manufacturing. Then consolidation. Smaller chip makers were acquired or went bankrupt. The survivors became massive conglomerates, and they made the same choice every dying industry makes. They offshored manufacturing. Intel still designs chips in America, but much of its production moved to Israel, Ireland, and partnerships in Asia. The most advanced chips are now made by TSMC in Taiwan and Samsung in South Korea. American companies still control intellectual property, but they don't control manufacturing. And here's why that's catastrophic. Manufacturing expertise and design expertise are linked. When you separate them, you lose both. The engineers who design chips need to understand manufacturing constraints. The people who run fabs need to understand design requirements. When you offshore production, you sever that connection. And over time, you lose the ability to do either. This is already happening. TSMC can manufacture chips at 3 nanometer scale. Intel is struggling to reach the same level. Not because American engineers are less capable, because the manufacturing expertise is in Taiwan. The equipment suppliers are in Asia. The supply chains are overseas. And once you lose that infrastructure, rebuilding takes decades and costs hundreds of billions. The US government passed the CHIPS Act in 2022, allocating $52 billion to rebuild semiconductor manufacturing. But here's the problem, that's not enough. TSMC is building one fab in Arizona. It will produce a fraction of what Taiwan produces, and it relies on equipment from ASML in the Netherlands, materials from Japan, and expertise brought in from Taiwan. The supply chain is still overseas, the knowledge is still overseas, and the financial incentives still favor offshoring, because building a fab in America costs 3 times what it costs in Asia. Labor is more expensive, regulations are stricter, and shareholders demand returns, not long-term strategic investments. So even with government subsidies, the structural pattern continues. Companies will take the subsidies, build minimal domestic capacity, and continue offshoring the majority of production. Because that's what financialization demands. This is the pattern, and it's not done. It's happening right now in pharmaceuticals, aerospace, machine tools, every advanced industry. The life cycle is always the same. Consolidation centralizes control in the hands of financial managers. Underinvestment prioritizes short-term profit over long-term capability. Offshoring moves production overseas, where costs are lower and investment wasn't neglected. Financialization turns companies into intellectual property portfolios, and dissolution completes the cycle, leaving behind empty buildings and destroyed communities. Here's why this keeps happening. The people who make these decisions are not irrational. They're responding to incentives. If you're a CEO, your compensation is tied to stock price. Stock price is driven by quarterly earnings. Earnings increase when you cut costs. The fastest way to cut costs is to defer investment and offshore production. So every CEO follows the same playbook. Not because they're evil, because that's what the system rewards. The shareholders, the board, the analysts, everyone is optimizing for short-term returns, and long-term industrial capacity is sacrificed. But here's the critical insight. The people who profit from this pattern are not the workers, not the communities, not even the companies. The real winners are the financial institutions that manage the process. When a company consolidates, investment banks collect fees for arranging the mergers. When it underinvests and pays dividends, asset managers collect returns. When it offshores, consulting firms collect fees for managing the transition. And when it financializes, private equity and hedge funds buy the remnants, extract the remaining value, and sell the intellectual property. The entire life cycle is profitable for financiers. Every stage generates fees, returns, and opportunities. The only people who lose are the workers who lose jobs, the communities that lose industries, and the country that loses strategic capacity. But those losses are dispersed and long-term. The profits are concentrated and immediate. So the pattern continues. Let me show you the mechanism that makes this inevitable. It's called the principal-agent problem, and it's at the heart of every industrial collapse. In a company, the owners are the shareholders. The agents are the executives who run the company. In theory, the agents should act in the interest of the owners, but in practice, their interests diverge. Shareholders in a public company are mostly institutions, pension funds, mutual funds, index funds. They hold thousands of stocks. They don't care about any single company's long-term health. They care about portfolio returns. So they pressure executives to maximize short-term stock price. Executives respond by doing whatever increases quarterly earnings, cutting R&D, deferring maintenance, offshoring production. These all boost short-term profits, but they destroy long-term capability. The executives don't care because they'll be gone in 5 years. They'll collect their bonuses and stock options and move to another company. The long-term consequences, the factory closures, the job losses, the loss of industrial capacity, those happen after they leave. This is the structural flaw. When ownership is separated from operation, when shareholders are distant and executives are transient, nobody has an incentive to preserve long-term value. Everyone is optimizing for their own short-term gain. And the company, the industry, the country, they all deteriorate. There's a term for this. It's called financialization. It's the process by which financial markets and financial institutions come to dominate economic decision-making. And it's the reason American industries keep dying, because financial logic prioritizes liquidity, short-term returns, and asset extraction. Industrial logic prioritizes capability, long-term investment, and productive capacity. And for 50 years, financial logic has won, every time. Now let me show you what this means for the industries that still exist. Look at aerospace. Boeing is one of the last major American manufacturers. It employs 170,000 people, and it's already deep into the life cycle. Consolidation happened in the 1990s. Boeing merged with McDonnell Douglas in 1997. The merger was supposed to strengthen Boeing, but what actually happened is McDonnell Douglas executives took over Boeing's management, and they brought a financial culture. Before the merger, Boeing was run by engineers. The CEO had a background in aviation. The company prioritized safety and engineering excellence. After the merger, the new leadership came from finance. They moved headquarters from Seattle to Chicago, away from the factories and engineers, and they prioritized stock price. The company started underinvesting in the 2000s. Instead of developing a new aircraft from scratch, Boeing modified the 737 design repeatedly. The 737 MAX was a 1960s airframe with modern engines bolted on. It was cheaper than designing a new plane, but it was less safe. The engineering compromises led to the MKAS system, which led to 2 crashes, which led to 346 deaths. This is what underinvestment looks like. You save money in the short term. You boost quarterly earnings. You increase stock buybacks. Boeing spent $43 billion on stock buybacks between 2010 and 2019, but you compromise the core product. And eventually, the system fails. Boeing is now offshoring. It outsources major components to suppliers around the world. Wings, fuselages, avionics. The company is becoming a final assembler, not a manufacturer, and the expertise is leaving. The engineers who understood how to build planes are retiring. The supply chain is fracturing, and the company is losing its capability. Financialization is next. Boeing's market value is increasingly tied to its defense contracts and intellectual property, not its manufacturing capability. The company is transitioning from builder to brand manager, and if the pattern holds, dissolution follows. Not tomorrow, not next year, but over the next 20 years, Boeing will continue to hollow out until it exists primarily as a design house and contract manager. The actual manufacturing, the factories, the workers, that will move overseas or disappear. This is the same life cycle. and it's happening to the last remaining American industrial giants. Here's what you need to understand about why this can't be stopped within the current system. The incentives are locked in. Public companies are required by law to act in the interest of shareholders. Courts have ruled repeatedly that shareholder value is the primary obligation. So executives who prioritize long-term industrial capacity over short-term stock price can be sued. They can be removed by the board. The system legally mandates financialization, and even if a company wanted to resist, the market would punish it. If Boeing announced it was cutting dividends and buybacks to invest $50 billion in new manufacturing infrastructure, the stock price would collapse. Activist. Investors would demand changes. Private equity would attempt a takeover. The financial system would force the company back into the extraction model. This is why the pattern repeats. It's not a series of bad decisions, it's a structural imperative. As long as financial markets control capital allocation, as long as executives are rewarded for short-term stock performance, as long as shareholders demand quarterly returns, industrial capacity will be sacrificed. You would need to change the legal structure of corporate governance. You would need to change how executives are compensated. You would need to change what shareholders can demand, and none of that is happening. Because the people who profit from the current system, the investment banks, the asset managers, the private equity funds, they have no interest in changing it. They are extracting trillions of dollars from the managed decline of American industry, and they will continue until there's nothing left to extract. Let me show you what this looks like at the community level. When a factory closes, the damage isn't just economic. It's social, political, structural. Take Youngstown, Ohio. In 1977, Youngstown Sheet and Tube announced it was closing its steel mills. 5,000 workers lost jobs, but the real number was much higher. For every steel job, there were 3 or 4 supporting jobs: suppliers, trucking, retail, services. When the mill closed, the entire ecosystem collapsed. Unemployment in Youngstown went from 5% to 24%. Property values fell by half. The tax base disappeared. Schools closed. Hospitals cut staff. The city couldn't maintain infrastructure. And the social fabric disintegrated. Crime increased. Drug use increased. Life expectancy decreased. Youngstown still hasn't recovered. 50 years later, the population is half what it was in 1970. The average income is 30% below the national average. The city is a monument to industrial collapse. And here's the critical insight. The people who made the decision to close the mills, the executives, the shareholders, the financial managers, none of them lived in Youngstown. They were in New York, Chicago, London. They experienced no consequences. They collected their returns and moved on. The costs were externalized. The workers, the families, the community, they bore the costs. The financiers captured the gains. This is the mechanism that allows the pattern to continue. The people who make the decisions are insulated from the consequences. They optimize for their own benefit, and the damage is absorbed by people with no power to resist. This same story has played out in hundreds of communities: Detroit, Flint, Gary, Allentown, Reading, countless towns across the Rust Belt. Each one followed the same pattern: consolidation, underinvestment, closure, collapse. And each time, the financial institutions profited while the communities were destroyed. Now let me show you what this means for national security, because this isn't just an economic issue. When you offshore production, you offshore strategic capacity. If the United States went to war tomorrow, it couldn't manufacture enough ammunition, vehicles, or electronics to sustain a prolonged conflict. The supply chains are overseas, the factories are closed, the expertise is gone. During World War II, America became the arsenal of democracy because it had massive industrial capacity. Factories that made cars could be converted to make tanks. Factories that made appliances could make radios and radar. The country could mobilize because the infrastructure existed. That's no longer true. If America needed to rapidly scale up production of semiconductors, batteries, or pharmaceuticals, it couldn't. The fabs are in Taiwan. The battery production is in China. The pharmaceutical ingredients are in India. The military is aware of this. But the warnings are ignored because fixing the problem would require reversing 50 years of financialization. It would require rebuilding industries that have been deliberately dismantled. And that's politically and economically impossible under the current system. So the vulnerabilities remain, and they're growing. Every year more production moves overseas, more expertise is lost, more supply chains are severed, and the country becomes more dependent on foreign manufacturing. This is the strategic cost of the financialization lifecycle. Short-term corporate profit is prioritized over long-term national security, and the people making the decisions don't care because they won't be around when the consequences arrive. Here's the final piece of the pattern, and it's the most disturbing. The life cycle doesn't just destroy industries, it creates a trap where rebuilding becomes nearly impossible. Once you lose manufacturing capacity, you lose the entire ecosystem. The suppliers, the equipment makers, the skilled workers, the engineers, the institutional knowledge, and you can't rebuild one piece without the others. Say you want to rebuild American textile manufacturing, you'd need to build mills, but the companies that made textile machinery are gone. You'd have to import machines from Europe or Asia. You'd need skilled workers. But nobody in America has been trained in textile manufacturing for 30 years. You'd have to bring in workers from overseas or spend a decade training new ones. You'd need suppliers, thread, dye, chemicals. But those supply chains are overseas. You'd have to rebuild them or depend on imports, and you'd need customers. But American clothing brands have spent 30 years building relationships with overseas manufacturers. They're not going to switch back unless you can offer better quality at lower cost, which you can't because your operations are new and inefficient. This is the trap. Once the ecosystem is destroyed, the cost of rebuilding exceeds the cost of continuing to offshore. So offshoring becomes permanent. The same trap exists in steel, electronics, semiconductors, every offshored industry. Rebuilding would require coordinated investment across the entire supply chain. It would require government support. It would require companies to sacrifice short-term profit for long-term capability. And none of that is happening because the financial system won't allow it. The CHIPS Act is an attempt to escape the trap in semiconductors. But $52 billion isn't enough. Rebuilding the entire semiconductor supply chain would cost $500 billion and take 20 years. And even if the government provided that money, it's not clear that companies would use it to rebuild capacity rather than extract subsidies and continue offshoring, because the structural incentives haven't changed. Executives are still rewarded for short-term stock performance, shareholders still demand quarterly returns, and financial markets still punish long-term investment. So the trap remains. Let me show you what this means for you personally. You're living through the final stages of American industrial collapse. The industries that remain, aerospace, pharmaceuticals, some advanced manufacturing, they're already deep into the life cycle. Consolidation is complete, underinvestment is underway, offshoring is accelerating, and financialization is turning companies into hollow brands. This means three things. First, jobs in these industries are precarious. If you work in aerospace, pharmaceuticals, or advanced manufacturing, understand that your company is following the same pattern that destroyed textiles, steel, and electronics. Your factory could close. Your division could be sold. Your job could be offshored, not because you did anything wrong, because the financial system demands it. Second, the communities that depend on these industries are at risk. If you live in a city or town built around a major manufacturer, understand that the company is optimizing for shareholder returns, not community stability. When the extraction is complete, they'll leave, and the damage will be permanent. Third, the country is becoming strategically vulnerable. The loss of manufacturing capacity is a national security crisis, and it's accelerating. The next major conflict will reveal supply chain weaknesses that could be catastrophic, and there's no plan to fix them. This isn't doom, it's pattern recognition. The life cycle has repeated across every major industry for 70 years, and it's still operating. The question is not whether it will continue. The question is whether you can see it happening and prepare accordingly. Here's what the people who understand this pattern are doing. They're not trying to stop it, they can't. The structural forces are too strong. Instead, they're positioning themselves to profit from it. Private equity firms buy manufacturing companies, extract maximum value through cost-cutting and asset sales, and discard the remains. Consulting firms charge millions to manage offshoring transitions. Asset managers collect fees from the entire process. The pattern is profitable if you're on the right side of it. The people who suffer are the ones who don't see it coming. The workers who thought their jobs were secure. The communities that thought the factories were permanent. The country that thought industrial capacity would always exist. They're the ones who bear the costs. And here's the final truth. This pattern won't stop until the financial system that drives it changes. As long as public companies are legally required to prioritize shareholder value, as long as executives are compensated based on stock price, as long as financial markets control capital allocation, industries will continue to die. The life cycle will repeat. The extraction will continue, and American industrial capacity will keep disappearing. 4 stages, 70 years, dozens of industries, consolidation, underinvestment, offshoring, financialization. This is how entire industries collapse, and it's happening right now. If you can see the pattern, you're ahead of most people. If you understand that this isn't random, that it's structural, that it's profitable for some and catastrophic for others, then you're starting to understand how the economy actually works. Subscribe if you want to keep seeing the patterns they don't teach you, because this isn't the last industry that will collapse. It's just the latest, and the people running the system already know which one is next.